Dr. Khyati Joshi is a scholar and thought leader on the intersecting issues of race, religion, and immigration in the United States. Dr. Joshi is co-founder of the Institute for Teaching Diversity and Social Justice, which offers multi-day institutes, customized workshops, and one-on-one and small group coaching for organizations and professionals seeking to build their equity and justice competencies. She is a full professor in the School of Education at Fairleigh Dickinson University. Professor Joshi engages educators, policymakers, and community leaders in an examination of the historical and systemic nature of bias, its consequences in everyday life, and the solutions that foster social justice and inclusiveness. In doing so, she provides clients with the tools to enhance both their own and their organization's ability to provide inclusive, meaningful services and experiences in an increasingly connected and diverse world. Dr. Joshi is the author and editor of multiple books and has contributed to numerous groundbreaking texts and journals in her field. Her writing and research illuminate structures and policies that are often invisible to inform race relations and interfaith work in the United States. Today, we talk about her book, White Christian Privilege. Definitely some trigger points in here. Highly recommend you listen, get a taste of it, buy her book. I think there's some really good stuff worth examining. Prepare, buckle up, white people, and listen in. Okay, enjoy. Cheers. All right. Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome yet again to our Get Mad Crusade. As you know, this month we've been focused on Christian nationalism. And today we have Dr. Khyati Joshi with us. And I'm just excited. Khyati, thanks for joining.
I'm so happy to be here.
So I got connected to Khyati through someone, and this was not a book I was thinking I would be reading, but White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. Talk about some triggering points. I hope it is triggering. I hope some of the things we discuss make you feel things, made me feel things. And again, the goal is to explore things that we're maybe not used to hearing or exploring new perspectives. So Dr. Khyati has that experience. So I'd love to just start with your background. So your parents came in 1971. Tell us that experience in growing up in America.
Sure. Yeah, they came from India, from Gujarat, India in 1971. My dad first came, and then my mom and I followed. And we're first in Altoona, Pennsylvania, then Akron, Ohio, and then finally Dad got a job in Atlanta, Georgia. And we moved to Atlanta in 1975, and that has been home ever since. Even though I live in New Jersey now, I still consider Atlanta home, as I consider Ahmedabad, India home too, because growing up, my parents sent me back to India almost every summer to be with my family there. Wow. And growing up in Atlanta, Georgia in the 70s and 80s as a little brown Hindu girl was not the easiest thing. People were kind of like, well, you're not white and you're not black, kind of what are you? And then on top of that, I said I was Hindu. My family said we were Hindu. So it was kind of like, what is going on here? Mm-hmm. So sometimes it was invisibility and, marginalization, which is problematic. But sometimes it was outright bullying and harassment that was really tough. I mean, my grades were not great in middle school, and it was really rough. Now, all the while, I was fortunate enough to have a small but strong Indian community. And literally I lived for the weekends because that's where I was happy.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how it was.
Yeah. And I mean, as I was reading and learning more about kind of immigration reform throughout time, your parents came pretty much right after the last real reform, I believe 1965 with Johnson. And I can only imagine even for them, because Asians weren't immigrating. So it was that was kind of, if I'm not mistaken, and I'd love for you to elaborate on that, were they some of the first people to really come to the States and again, just such a small community because there weren't a lot of them here at the time?
Yeah. So you are right, Michael, about the Immigration Act of 1965. What's important to know is that our doors to Asian immigration was shut in 1917. I mean, it's called the Immigration Act of 1917, and it barred immigration from present-day Iran through South Asia into Southeast Asia. If you were from this part of the planet, you weren't getting into the United States. There were a few exceptions, including 1946 Hart-Celler Act, but it is in 65 where our doors were opened again. Mm-hmm. And indeed, my family, I think we are probably one of the first 15 Indian families to settle in Atlanta, Georgia. Wow. There were many other Indian folks because of Georgia Tech specifically, because students were coming over. Yeah. But I do think, based on what I know, that we were probably one of the first 15 families.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just think it's so honoring to think of what that journey had to have been like. So I kind of want to just dive in, and there's some terms in your book. There's some concepts that I think maybe aren't as commonly known that would hopefully pique people's interest to learn about. Because I feel like as I'm reading them, I realize how much it influences a lot of society today. So I'm just kind of curious for you to dive a little deep into what is the Doctrine of Discovery?
Sure. The Doctrine of Discovery is not something a lot of folks know about. It's a series of papal dictates in the 15th century that came out, and that basically said, if any of the monarchs were to the explorers, as we learned about them in elementary school here in the United States, if any of the explorers representing monarchs were to come upon land not owned by another monarch, European monarch, it was their land for the taking. It was their land for the taking. And so the colonizers paid no attention to the indigenous population that was all throughout the Americas, because it was theirs for the taking, according to the papal dictate. And then that really undergirds another very important concept of manifest destiny. Right.
So I guess, from that end, that's what I was going to ask. I was so what's theology? What was their justification for the Doctrine of Discovery, which I guess leads into manifest destiny?
Yeah, the Puritans believed they were ordained by God, right, to take this land from sea to shining sea. And that's what they set out to do. And they were propelled, if you will, by the Doctrine of Discovery. And then manifest destiny. I mean, we learned about manifest destiny in elementary school because it was how we took all this land. Kids still today learn about the Oregon Trail and what was done. We're still not learning enough of what happened in all the different ways we subjugated and essentially committed genocide of the Native American population. And we see how much these communities are struggling today.
So when I think of some of these things, like Trail of Tears and how we treated Native Americans, I hear a lot of common pushback of well, one, that was back then, or two, we've apologized, or we've said things, or whatever people justify to say, well, that's a different time period. But I'm almost curious from your perspective, because I feel like there's still this theological undergirding of manifest destiny, really, in a lot of churches. And so how they view the world is almost still the same way. But in your research, what did you find when it came to a lot of Christian theology about maybe the fall of a nation, hence Christian nationalism, or how we view us as being an elevated person in the world?
So one of the things from the time of, the beginning of this country, and even, for the century before, when we think about Christianity, first of all, we have to look at, and what my book sets out to show, is the role of Christianity in the construction of whiteness. So what has happened is that a lot of things, for example, let's just take Native Americans, because we were talking about them. What has happened between the Puritans and then the subsequent groups that came over and Native Americans is really talked about in terms of race. But there's so much there around those who were Christian, seeing them as heathens and savages, and that it is Christians who are civilized and others who are uncivilized, right? I mean, the C in colonization stands for Christianity. The two go hand in hand, right? And so this idea of the gospel of being the way, and of course we see that today in Christian nationalism. And what I'll say about white Christian nationalism is that imagine a cake, okay? The cake is what I'm talking about with Christian privilege and Christian normativity. What I'm talking about is pointing out how Christianity is embedded in our legal and social edifice. Okay, it is there. And that's how Christians have been given advantages. Christian nationalism is the icing on the cake. It is those who truly believe somebody like me can never be American and should not be here. But I want to make a distinction here because even folks such as yourself, right, have Christian privilege, even though you might be completely against Christian nationalism, right? And so it's really important to see that folks who are atheist and agnostic, who've grown up with Christianity, have Christian privilege, right? Because Christian privilege in general, whether we're talking male privilege, white privilege, let's talk white privilege for a second. What is white privilege? Mm-hmm. It's a series of advantages that white people have in this country that came from systemic racism. You didn't do a darn thing to have that privilege. You have it because of the way society has been constructed. So the same is there for Christianity. We see the ways that Christians are advantaged in our society.
Yeah. And I think a lot when people say things like, well, look at me in my life and clearly I'm not doing that well and I'm white. And I go like, but if you went to, let's just say you had an opportunity to get a loan, for example, or there's a number of examples you use, you would more likely statistically have a simpler time than someone who wasn't white, let alone maybe male white. And there's numerous examples of that. But I kind of want to back up. So, maybe Christian nationalism was too quick into that. You have three kind of categories that you talk about in your book. And I think maybe naming them is going to be helpful for people. So maybe starting with privilege, but then definitely tacking on normativity and hegemony.
Sure. So when we talk about Christian privilege and religious oppression or any of the isms, racism, classism, sexism, these exist at three levels, right? The individual level, which is where a lot of people think everything happens, but that's only one level. Then there's the societal cultural level. These are the kind of unspoken rules, norms, social mores of kind of what is normal, how to be, we know what is meant. If somebody says dress business casual, you know what that means, right? It's not spelled out, but that's the societal cultural level. Mm-hmm. And then there's the institutional level, okay? Our laws, our history, our institutions. So Christian privilege is at that individual level. It is the way that Christians on an everyday level have privilege. And what do I mean by that? It is the way they are able to go about their lives as Christians and not have to think twice because society has been constructed for you. So for example, holidays are always off for you, the significant ones, right? You don't have to make special provisions to celebrate your most major holiday, whether you may consider that Easter or you may consider that Christmas. Mm-hmm. Society has been constructed around those things, right? Or you're able to find what you need to celebrate those holidays in stores, right? The Christian normativity is that societal cultural level, Michael, where things that are Christian are just so normative, are just so part of our everyday that they're considered American. So, for example, the opening of city council meetings and the opening of Congress, for example, with a prayer, and it will be a Christian prayer. It might be a non-denominational Christian prayer, right? Some places might say, "Hey, we're going to invite a rabbi, or we're going to invite an imam," but the Christian minister will always be there. It won't be like, well, we just need one representative to say a prayer. You're going to have the Christian one. Or the way that language is normative. So my whole life I've been asked, so Khyati, what's your Christmas? Or what's your Bible? What's your Bible called? And I'm thinking, well, we actually have many sacred scriptures in Hinduism, and some religions don't even have one. It's oral tradition, right? But the normative are the Christian items. And I also want to add, Michael, that this is not necessarily, sometimes it's not about right and wrong. It's just about noticing what is there, what is there. And then Christian hegemony is about business as usual, kind of. It is the way that being Christian in America is again, the way that Christianity is just embedded in our legal and social edifice. And one example I can give you, well, first of all, we see this in Supreme Court rulings. I can bring up some of the free exercise issues, or we see it even recently in Supreme Court rulings where even what we see happening is among all civil liberties, religion is having what I call, or what scholars have called, MFN status, most favored nation status. Okay. It's the identity that's most privileged. And we have cases before the court right now on religious schools and vouchers. And, I just don't know these would be given this attention if these were Muslim schools or Jewish day schools who were trying to get government funds to make sure the busing happens and other things happen. So those are the three different levels.
Yeah. And it's funny, again, if you're listening to this, and I don't care if you love it or you don't like it, I still encourage you to read the book. It helps you see things. So we were at a book fair on a weekend for my kids. So the school is putting on public school book fair. And we were there, and there was a booth that was doing face painting, but it was all subtle, put on by a particular organization for child evangelism. And they would literally be quoting verses to the kids while they were painting their faces. But What's crazy is you had to sign a form that okayed it. So that was maybe their bypass because it was a public school thing. And as long as you signed this real quick, then your child could participate. And then my child got a tract at the end. Now, a year ago, 6 months ago, before I read a tract, like a Bible tract, basically telling them the salvation story, the classic Romans 3:23 kind of thing. And a year ago, I would have been annoyed. I would have been like, I just been annoyed, right? Now, I saw it completely different because my kid ran out to me, handed me the tract, and I looked around. I saw my friend over here in her, she wasn't wearing a full burqa, but she had her head covering and everything. Look over here. I see several other women with head coverings. And I thought to myself, I wonder how the school would feel about a Muslim thing wanting to pop up and do the same thing. Hey, let's paint some faces, but at the end, and I know what the answer would be, right? I know what the uprising would be. But it changed my perspective on that experience just from thinking through these underlying things. So,
I would say, Michael, that I would argue in one sense, that's the answer. Now, it gets a little tougher when, evangelism comes into play. But in general, I am in favor of adding religions and not necessarily taking out Christianity. And that's very important to me. And my atheist and agnostic friends would, argue with me there, and that's okay. But we need more religious literacy. And that's why I say when the evangelism bit comes in, it's a little different because, then I have issues with that, needless to say, because as somebody growing up, also one of the things I heard constantly was, well, you're damned to hell, right? Because you don't accept Jesus as your Lord and personal Savior. And it wasn't until I took a class on the life of Jesus, that's what it was called, at Emory University as an undergraduate religion major, that I said to myself, you know what? I don't know of what I was told my entire life.
Right. Yeah.
But in general, I think, whatever we can do to bring in other faiths is really critical, not necessarily removing Christianity.
So let's address that then from a human level, because I don't know if people listening to this are going to ask, but at the end of the day, what are the goals? So it's like, okay, Khyati, you want equality and religious equality, even though I think we have it, but what are the goals? And you kind of mentioned it just now about adding, but elaborate, because I think it's helpful for people to realize we're not trying to rob things.
Right. Well, and that's the thing, right? When you've always been given what you want that is important for you, now having to think about others and thinking about, well, we need to let them allow, maybe I forego my turn. That's why some people get bent out of shape, right? And feel like their religion is being taken away. But to answer your question, here's one example I can give you. What I want to see is I want to see religions embraced in authentic ways by mainstream America. And so, for example, at the President Biden's inauguration, I think it was the second day was the day of prayer. And they had an entire day on Zoom, or maybe 5 hours, where you had people of different Native American spiritualities, of different people of different religious backgrounds, saying a prayer or a chant. And it was billed as an interfaith event. Well, let me tell you how Christian normative it was, because what they could do, even though it was interfaith, was dictated by Protestant Christian norms, right? So they were told it had to be in English. They were told that they had 30 seconds and everything had to be approved ahead of time. Again, the English language bit coming in. I do think a few Native nations were able to represent a dance instead of saying a prayer. But I vividly remember the Hinduism segment, and it was 45 seconds and it was a prayer in English. And even though I don't understand Sanskrit, I do know my Sanskrit prayers. And there's a lot of value that comes from just hearing the Sanskrit, even if I don't always know what it means. And the fact that I was hearing it in English, I was like, this might as well be a Christian prayer.
Yeah.
So I think that, interfaith is still often done where it's, familiar to the Christian eye, is how I would say it, right? So I would like to see religions embraced in an authentic way. I want to see, Michael, religious literacy. We need to know a little bit about each other's religions. I mean, I have students who are like, Professor Joshi, I went to, Catholic school for at least 6 years, and I'll ask them to name the 4 Gospels. They're like, I can't do it. Right. Yeah. And I'm like, that's okay. That's okay. Don't worry. But these are the basics we need to know. I should know what as a person living in this country, I should know what is the significance of the 4 Gospels for Christians. But you know what? Then you also need to know why the Gita is important. What are the major holidays for those who are Muslim? What are the major cities? In the book at the end, I mention knowing your A, B, C, D, and E's. And A stands for architecture, right? Knowing what are the various houses of worship called. So you're not saying to me, Khyati, where's your church? Oh, do you mean the Hindu temple or the mandir? Okay, right. B stands for books, knowing the names of Holy Scripture. C stands for cities, so that we know beyond Jerusalem, beyond Bethlehem, the cities that carry such great spiritual relevance and significance for people. And D stands for holy days. And E stands for everyday lived religion, which if we have time, we can talk about.
I mean, I would love to talk about that. I'm just more curious from your perspective, and maybe it's hard for me because I feel like it's an easy answer, but maybe it's because I've been thinking this way and studying for a long time and I have a long way to go. But why from your perspective is it so hard? Is it just because it's that ingrained in culture that even people who are willing to try still just operate in normativity? But like, what is because you brought up a good point that challenged me earlier. You talked about the icing of Christian nationalism, and I think it's too easy to kind of like point out the devil of that and go, that's the problem. But maybe that's not actually it. It is really what your book's about, which is this normativity, this privilege. But I don't know, maybe take a step further. Like, why do you think it's so hard for people to hear what we're talking about? Why is it hard for them? Why are they so mad about prayer in schools? From your experience and what you've seen, why is that?
Well, so first of all, people have this visceral reaction to the notion of privilege. Like, what do you mean I'm privileged? No, I've worked hard. I grew up working class poor. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. How can you, Professor Joshi, tell me that I'm privileged, right? So there's a lack of understanding because we don't know our real United States history. We don't know. We're told that this is a land of immigrants. And, I've used that phrase a lot myself. And it is a slap in the face to those who are Native American to say that we are a land of immigrants. We don't know our real U.S. history, so we don't know the different ways that whiteness has been advantaged. So it can just look like everybody's on the same level playing field when they're not. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason is it goes against the myth of, I've worked hard. I've worked hard and I've made it, and you just don't want to work hard. You just want everything handed to you, right? Which also goes back to history. The third thing is this is religious. This is deep and personal. And how dare you say, when I believe in Jesus, how dare you say that I have advantage? Jesus tells me to, hate the sin, but love the sinner, right? All these things. And I think that when it's that deep personal piece, it's really hard. The fourth reason is what you started out with, is that it is just so ingrained that, well, now I've had this my whole life and now you're going to take it away? Wait a minute. Nobody had a problem with the 10 Commandments being on this property until there was an increase in religious diversity. And it was all good when you people weren't here, right? Then nobody complained about anything. And so it's this idea of equality seeming like unfairness to them, because now we're saying you've got to take other voices into account.
Yeah, but Khyati, there's only 2% of this group and 2% of that group and 65% of us. And if you actually want to include Black people, I guess there's like 85% Christians. So why should we bend over backwards for you guys?
Well, because we go back to the founding documents, right? And you realize those demographics that you just named, they were socially engineered to be that way because not anybody could come over and not everybody could come over. The United States immigration policy has often said who can come and who can't. And so, it's not been a level playing field from the get-go.
Right. Yeah, like there's only 2% of blank demographic. It's like, yeah, just look at history and don't know why there's only 2%. Like probably be a lot more at this point. I'm like scared to get into immigration stuff just because that's a whole nother thing. Let's jump back to the everyday, the E. I do. I want to hear some more because I agree with you wholeheartedly. Our religious understanding is so low, almost as bad as our geographical understanding of the world. And both of those things are very problematic. But yeah, talk to us about the E, the everyday. You said it was everyday religious living or everyday
lived religion. Lived religion is a concept out of religious studies that really says we've got to consider, it's one thing to know the tenets of the faiths. Okay. It's one thing to understand Muslims pray 5 times a day. It's another thing to understand, okay, Christians go to church on Sundays and do X, Y, and Z. And, Jews keep kosher. and observe Shabbat and things, right? Lived religion says we've got to take into account the everyday contradictions, the ways that religion exists in people's lives. So we're looking at, instead of how people go to religion, how religion comes to them and just kind of is in their lives. And I find that very helpful to actually having conversations in communities. So everyday religion is about, so in my very first study, in my dissertation that became my book, I interviewed this one Muslim man. He's Indian Muslim. And he always was like, look, I make time for Friday prayers. I make sure to go to the masjid. But let me tell you something, Islam never made me put down a drink. Okay. He's Muslim. He drinks alcohol and he considers himself Muslim, right? I have friends who are Jewish, who are very, very proud and steadfast in their faith and to be Jewish, and they don't keep kosher. Many Christians don't go to church every Sunday and still consider themselves good Christians, and that's fine, right? That's the everyday bit. That's the lived religion. And so what I want folks to know, whether it's teachers or other people I'm working with, is if you think you know about the faith, but you encounter somebody who does something different, that's everyday lived religion, right? Don't be like, well, I thought Hindus were vegetarian, or I thought Jews kept kosher, right? I mean, when I'm feeling really cheeky and somebody's like, oh, I thought Hindus, I'll be biting into my chicken sandwich, and somebody else be like, oh, I thought Hindus were vegetarian. And I'm like, well, I thought Christians go to church every Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Now, that's me being a little cheeky, and I'm not always like that. But it's that concept, because when you only know one thing about a faith, then we kind of just flatten it.
Right.
Right. So the everyday lived religion takes into account the contradictions and conflicts that can arise.
I mean, to me, this whole crusade, the concepts that we are trying to introduce, or I should back up, say there's two words that we want to use a lot, which is complexity and nuance. And obviously learning the everyday lived religion is just a nuanced way of seeing people. And I don't understand why religion is seen as this blanket thing versus anything else, like how we drive cars or how we whatever. But you're right. It's we should see that there's nuance in all of it. And I don't know, maybe people are just fearful of the unknown. That's a conclusion I'm starting to draw. Like, why are people so afraid of nuance or understanding the complexity of things? And I guess people want confident, sure answers. One thing, I don't know why this popped in my head, but I just wanted you to share it. When did Under God enter the Pledge of Allegiance?
Oh, so that's the Pledge of Allegiance during the Cold War in the 1950s. Before that, it was not there. But the government decided the United States needed to differentiate itself from those godless communists. And that's when we decided to put in the phrase under God. The other thing that was going on during that time, you have to remember, is that we had several Supreme Court cases around religion in schools, and notably two, Engel versus Vital in 62, I believe. Yeah. And Abington v. Shemp in 63. And in both of these cases, government was taking Bible reading and devotion out of school. It was not taking religion out of school, but conservative Christian America, eventually becoming the religious right, really saw it as the government taking religion out of schools. And they were then and continue to be very good at marketing. And so everybody believed that religion was taken out of schools. And that's just not true. Actually, in the Supreme Court decision, when Justice Tom Clark was giving the decision, he said that one's education is actually not complete without the study of religion. And that's for public education, right? Yeah. So all of that is there also, but under God is put in the 50s.
That I just thought of something that's just so triggering for me when I think about the fact that a lot of times we talk about democracy and number of voters. Am I being loud enough?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. When we talk about democracy, we talk about like votes, right? So then we think about, well, if we vote this in, if we keep voting against abortion, say, for example, for a hot topic, true. But I guess I just never thought, again, privilege, never thought about the fact that we dominate the nation. And so likely we will keep voting those things. And I'm sure some people will argue that's just the way it is. But that's one thing I just wonder if we got to figure out from a lawful perspective, from a founding principle perspective, what it even means to be America, what it means to be a nation, so that we can actually start from a baseline, almost like start over from a baseline. Because, the religious right obviously organizes well and better than others oftentimes. And it is fair in the sense of democracy, but it's not necessarily fair in the sense of privilege and even percentage of representation, because we've prevented that.
Well, and also the thing is that we have to remember, right? There are many Christian groups that don't believe abortion is the central moral question of the day. Right. That don't believe gay marriage equality is the central moral question of the day. But the religious right has gotten to define what are the central moral questions of the day. And, I need my Christian friends who believe otherwise to speak loud and proud, and religious minorities and humanists and atheists will too. But y'all, you doing what you're doing with, the coffee crusade is so very important. Because I actually think our voices are louder. We're just not as organized, and we are going up against 350 years of Christian hegemony, right? That's why people get, all like, well, Christianity, you hear this from Pew Research and other places that there are fewer and fewer people going to church. There are more and more people who identify as unaffiliated, None of that is reducing the amount of Christian hegemony that is in our world, because that's a product of history. Right. And so we've got to keep that in mind.
So I want to ask you this, Khyati, and I kind of want to take this two directions. One would be, what can people do? What kind of reading? Obviously, your book. Please go read White Christian Privilege. But also maybe some practical day-to-day. What can people do? And then I also want you to kind of talk a little bit about big picture solutions. So you kind of mentioned organizing. Politics can be one, but get into that a little bit. Get into the politics, laws, ideas, what can change. But let's start with kind of what can people do to just learn more and be more open to privilege and normativity and hegemony?
Well, I think, reading this book and reading about privilege in general is really, really important. And it will make you uncomfortable. My goal is not to make you uncomfortable, but that's a bit of a byproduct. But just know that when you are feeling uncomfortable, you are on a learning edge and you are actually learning a lot. It's just that your body is having this reaction to you being uncomfortable. And that's really, really important on so many topics related to equity and justice. I want folks to get involved, and we really need to have religious literacy in our schools. We need to know about the major world faiths. And if we don't learn about them, we're going to have further and further problems. I think we're seeing the byproduct of not learning about each other of the last 3 or 4 decades, and we're seeing what can happen, right? So basic religious literacy is a must in our country, is really a must, and pushing for that. I know of one school district in the country that has a world religions requirement, and that is Modesto, California, which is a fairly conservative place. But they have it. And it's completely constitutional to teach about religion. You can't preach, but you can teach, right? And that's really important. So, working on that and getting that into our schools, I would say is really important. The other thing is sometimes school districts and workplaces, will like employees can take a floating holiday to observe their own, holiday they want to. That's a step in the right direction. It's just that those who are Christian get their holidays and the floating holidays, right? And so it's still not entirely equal. And I think it's recognizing that when somebody brings up like, well, we may need to consider having this holiday off, the first thing that happens is like, well, when does it stop? I mean, how many holidays can we give off? And then like, when's the business going to be open? Here's the thing. This is where diversity is important. So I'll give you the case in point, an example of my father-in-law. He's a pediatrician in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And my father-in-law had, for a while there, a partner who was Muslim and a partner who was Jewish. And guess what? They could all take their respective holidays because somebody else was there to cover.
Right.
And it wasn't a problem.
Yeah.
And that was the beauty of not having three Christian doctors, but having the religious diversity, right? And that's the kind of magic we can start seeing when we have institutions that are diverse. You know, my father-in-law had no problem covering Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, all of those days so that his colleague could cover it. I mean, could celebrate it. It's a, you know what, in the language of elementary or middle school kids, it's a no duh. You know?
It's a no duh because you're in that phase now, right? Or I guess your kid's a little bit older than that, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I used to say that all the time. No duh. You know, like, well, it's a no duh. So those are some of the things. But then getting our policymakers to recognize, the holidays as a start. It's a really important start. You know, here in New Jersey, Governor Murphy has a Diwali celebration. He has an Eid celebration. He has a Christmas party. You know, he has a Seder, all at the governor's mansion. Those are important things.
Yeah. I'm with you. I mean, I think education is key, and hopefully, and being open to those who are maybe more ignorant, so that we can help them understand instead of shun them. I'm curious if you're willing to go this route to kind of close things up. You have a kid; they're biracial. And bi-religious too, if I'm not mistaken. What have you seen in the differences between your upbringing back then and their upbringing now? Do you feel like, and obviously it's their experience, so maybe there's some nuance here, but like, have you seen change? Like, do you feel like there's more acceptance and reception than when you were a kid?
Absolutely. Oh, 100%. 100%. There's no question. There's absolutely no question. Many of us talk about, I mean, so many people now know what Diwali is or Holi is. Mm-hmm. You know, Eid is when, 30 years ago, nobody knew these holidays. Right. So there's no question about that. In the case of my son, who does identify as both Episcopalian and Hindu, he's like, am I an Episcadoo?
I like that.
He has been baptized. He has gone through confirmation, and he has also had his janoi, his thread ceremony. So we have raised him with both faiths. It was really important for me and my husband to do that. We have tried to live our lives living each other's religion. And so, for example, there are a few days of the year I fast. Janmashtami, which is Krishna's birthday, Shivratri, which just passed, Mahashivratri, which recognizes, Shiva and Parvati's wedding, many things around Shiva. I fast. Well, so does John. He fasts too. before pandemic, we would go to church together,
Yeah.
things like that. And I think the one example I can give you of just how we've lived our lives this way is that there was one year, Diwali was in November, and the Sunday before Thanksgiving at our church, we do what's called the Feast of Thanks and Giving. And it's a big potluck and a talent show, and we have a really good time. And so I had signed up to go to church to, help set up and do things beforehand to prepare for that evening. Well, our Hindu temple had reached out to John to ask him to come speak, because that was the night of their Diwali dinner. Because, Diwali will be on a certain day, but then there'll be events in its orbit, kind of like Christmas parties and Christmas, Well, he said, the Christian said yes to the Hindu folks. The Hindu had said and volunteered to organize at church. So that Sunday, the Hindu, went to church and did our thing. And John, the Christian, went to the Hindu temple to do his thing. And I think that's really emblematic of how we've lived our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's beautiful. And if anyone listening actually feels feelings about that, you know what, guess what? You're not responsible for the world. People have religious freedom to make their own decisions. But I really like the answer about your son, because I think it's easy to get trapped in cynicism. And yet most change comes over time. And especially if we can reach back and then have conversations like this with someone like yourself who grew up in a different time period and really see that change, that's encouraging. And I want anyone who is doing this work to be encouraged to know, keep it going. Let's keep pushing. It just takes time. And sometimes we don't even see the change, but that's really cool. That's cool to hear. And I'm glad that he's had hopefully a mostly positive experience where you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are still people who don't understand. We always prepped him. I said, Baba, someday you're going to meet somebody who says you can't be both, and you're just going to say, I am. Like, would somebody say you can't be both? Right. And my husband was like, yeah, it's probably going to be some of my people. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, no, not necessarily. We've got staunch Hindu nationalists out there too, No,
it's true. So,
so we've just always prepped him that way, that no matter what anybody says, you are both.
And I think that would be helpful too, not learning about religion, but also learning that all of us, for the most part, have intense nationalism in its history and current day. And there's a common denominator I think we can all rally around with the same goal, which is the coexistence of people who want a democratic country that pursues liberty and justice for all. That doesn't seem that hard when you say it, but
it's not. You just, you need to know people who are different than you. That's step number one.
Well, there you go. That's what I love. Step one, go out, folks. And if you don't know,
that's right.
If you don't know a brown person, if you don't know a black person, if you don't know a Hindu, Muslim, Nation of Islam, whatever, go meet them and ask them questions. Khyati, for the sake of time, I just want to say thank you so much. Hopefully there was just enough in here to pique people's interest. Folks, do go check out White Christian Privilege. It's online. And it's worth the read. It was very challenging for me. And I think its content is stuff that we should all be digesting. So
it's also on Audible for those who are listen, to books.
Yeah, there you go. Do you read it? That'd be fun.
No.
Probably a white guy.
Some people wanted me to, but you apparently, it really needs to, unless you're super famous, it needs to be like an actress or an actor, because they kind of, I don't know, get how to do this. So it's actually another Indian American woman who reads it.
That's awesome. So at least they can match it a little bit and make sure it's not, because that would be ironic. That would be really fun.
Oh yeah, no, that would not have happened.
Khyati, thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Y'all continue to get mad. Thanks for joining, and we will see you again soon.
Get mad. Get Mad Priest Coffee.